My name is Richard Novak. I'm the Vice President for Continuing Studies in Distance Education at Rutgers University, and we are delighted to bring you the second half of our online learning conference. This second half of the conference kicks off with a panel keynote presentation, something that is relatively new for us, but we thought absolutely fitting since everything is new and we are bringing you a virtual conference for the first time. Why not? Why not? So we have with us this afternoon 4 experts from around the country, and they are Josh Kim at Dartmouth, Eddie Maloney at Georgetown University, David Schejbal at Marquette University, and Karen Sibley at Brown University. I am going to ask each of them to identify themselves and what their role is at their respective institutions. And then we will begin with some key questions for our panelists. So I'm going to pick up at the top of the list with Josh.
Hey everyone, great to hang out with all of you guys. I'm Josh Kim. I'm the Director of Online Programs and Strategy at Dartmouth, and I'm a Senior Scholar at Candles, and Eddie will tell you what Candles is.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Josh. So I'm Eddie Maloney. I'm the Executive Director of our Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, CNDLS, which we call Candles, which is what Josh just mentioned. I'm also a professor in the Department of English and the founding director and professor in our graduate program on learning, design, and technology. That's all at Georgetown University.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Schejbal. I'm Vice President and Chief of Digital Learning at Marquette University, but I'm in a transition phase from Marquette to Excelsior College in Albany, New York, where I will start as the new president in August.
Congratulations, David, and thank you for being with us. And Karen.
And I was really looking forward to congratulating David, so I'm glad to hear that news. I'm Karen Sibley. I'm at Brown University. I serve in the Provost's office as Vice President for Strategic Initiatives, which, as you can imagine, means who knows what will come next. But right now, it's about COVID response. And so I'm serving on one of the dynamic response teams for online learning and preparedness for what lies ahead in terms of a fall semester, et cetera.
Thank you, Karen. So to kick this off, let's set a little bit of context. This stark and unsettling reality of the novel coronavirus COVID-19 has probably done more to disrupt higher education in a shorter period of time than arguably any other trend or development or impact that's occurred in potentially the history of higher education. And so we have all had to adjust, adapt, adopt, abandon in order to continue to keep our institutions going. And for this session, we have used a conceptual construct of continuity. And we've talked about this in 3 types of continuity: academic or instructional continuity, business continuity. How do we keep the institution afloat? How do we stay in the black? How do we have more revenue than expenses? Or how do we mitigate the financial damage? And finally, community continuity. How do we keep community going? One of the hallmarks of our colleges and universities around the country on campus is the sense of community. So how do we keep community going, both at a macro level and at a micro level in individual classes? So our panel is looking at this, and if you think of a matrix, so we've got 3 levels, 3 layers of continuity: academic and business and community continuity. And then we have different moments in time. So when the pandemic first hit, we had an emergency response. There was literally overnight that people moved to remote and online instruction. After a period of time, several weeks, a month, etc., we moved to a maintenance mode. And that was to get through the rest of the spring semester. And we have learned a lot of lessons from that. And that has informed our planning for both summer and fall. So I'm going to ask our panelists to talk about what their institution did, what their respective institutions did in those first two phases, in the emergency phase and then in the maintenance phase. So once we stabilized, then how did we maintain for the rest of the spring semester? Once again, I'm going to go in alpha order, but I'm going to go in reverse order. So Karen, I would like to pick up with you first. And if you would talk to us about what happened at Brown.
So, of course, as is true with everyone's institution, I think, first we were a little bit sort of, how are we going to reduce our activities gradually, day by day? And then suddenly it was just, no, everybody is leaving. I think one of the interesting things that we did that maybe wasn't great was that we gave students a week to depart from campus. Thinking that they would need time to make their plans, of course. Well, we were also taking away their spring break. So you can imagine what the first few days after the announcement were like on and around campus. And fairly quickly, students were asked to leave a little sooner than that 1 week. Of course, we had some students who could not leave for a variety of reasons, many of them international students. So we remained in place with about 380 students who still needed critical services. So we rapidly had to pivot all of our courses into online instruction, and we are not an institution that does very much in online instruction. We have prepared a number of courses for online teaching over the past 10 years or so, so we weren't without experience, and we have a very good digital teaching and learning team. But it was very shocking for the faculty to have to pivot in that fashion. I would say that the resilience of the faculty and the students has been incredibly rewarding, remarkable, and warming. Some students went to places where they didn't have adequate bandwidth to join their courses, or didn't in fact have the adequate technology. And the team in computing and information services did everything in their power to address that and to get those students up and running. And other students and faculty did much the same. So we had a successful semester. We just graduated our students in a virtual ceremony like everyone else did. We graduated our medical students actually about 4 weeks early because they wanted to get onto the front lines, and they did. So it's been amazing, the sense of community, what people have done, the resilience really, but it's also draining. And I think one of the things we say to ourselves all the time is we went through a sprint, but now we're in the marathon. So you have to pace yourself and be ready for the activities. We have a number of really strong planning teams that have divided up into focus areas. And we're doing, I think, a really good job. The leadership of the university is doing a really good job to both prepare for what comes next and also to be as clear as they possibly can. Communications have been so important because in the absence of communication, there's all sorts of building anxiety. And so I think the president and the provost in particular, but all of the officers and staff members working on these teams are doing a remarkable job, as is the faculty, of preparing for next steps.
Thank you, Karen. And David, I'm going to turn next to you to find out what happened at Marquette. And I'm assuming that in your role as vice president, that a lot of this fell in your lap.
Well, it was very much of a team effort, as you might imagine. But, the first step is, and I'm sure this is true at nearly every institution across the country, we had to set up the equivalent of an online field hospital where we triaged the most serious issues. Our main concern was to get students home safely, to get faculty off campus safely, and to make sure that everybody remained healthy and could remain connected. So one of our concerns was to make sure that students, especially students who might come from disadvantaged backgrounds, had the means to connect, whether it was the bandwidth or the computer equipment or whatever it was. Many of our faculty didn't have the experience teaching online, and so we didn't really move to online teaching for the second half of the spring semester. We moved to distance delivery. So we used whatever technology was most comfortable for faculty and students. For many faculty, we used Teams to be able to continue a lecture type modality for faculty in real time. Encouraged assignments to be delivered in D2L. Faculty who were experienced teaching in D2L were certainly encouraged and supported to do that. But as many of you know, putting a class into a true online format is not a quick process. And it's usually a team effort where you take a subject matter expert and a instructional designer, a media developer, and those individuals work together to create a meaningful learning experience for students in the form of a course. Of course, we didn't have that kind of time. And so we made sure that students could continue to learn and that we had continuity of instruction in whatever way worked for both faculty and students. And so that took us about 2 weeks. We had spring break, of course, and then the week after spring break, we had students continue to study, but they were essentially asked to review materials, do readings, but not participate in active classes. And it was the following week that students participated in active classes and finished out the semester. Like many institutions, we adjusted our grading policies to be more lenient, to address the issues of the move to distance delivery. And we helped students finish out the spring semester.
Thanks, David. Eddie, what about at Georgetown?
Thinking about this question, Richard, it's just occurred to me how far back spring feels right now. I'm trying to remember what we did in spring. It feels like it was 3 years ago. So I think, like Karen and David said, and congratulations, David, it's really exciting news. I think, like Karen and David said, we all were trying to figure out how to move into a virtual learning environment, remote instruction, obviously making the distinction that I think we all kind of came to, that this is not online learning, as David so nicely just kind of talked through, was important for us as well. We had 4 days, I guess, if you count Sunday, to move everybody over to a kind of remote environment when the decision was made. It was a really quick move, and we tried to follow a couple of simple principles and ask faculty to do a few different things. And we didn't actually try to be dogmatic about that at all, but we asked faculty to engage with their students, to deliver material to their students, and to assess their students in whatever ways they felt like they could do that. But in doing so, we asked them to keep it simple, kind of the primary principle, to not try to be perfect, that we really tried to emphasize that this was a moment where we were all trying to move together, and to be compassionate and transparent and open with our students. And so to follow those principles of deliver, engage, assess, or those activities, but with the principles of, don't try to be perfect, don't try to keep it simple, and to be compassionate and understanding with yourselves as well as with the students, and to recognize that that was an important part of what we were asking everybody to do. And then, of course, we did, I think, the things that a lot of schools did. We focused in on tricky courses that had lab components or experiential components, or things that were really difficult to move into a remote environment. We tried to help faculty think about the difference between translating their course into this remote environment, continuing it, but also adapting it. And that adaptation is kind of where we're going now, getting out of that mindset of translation and into one of adaptation, depending on what the fall brings.
Thanks, Eddie. Josh, I'm going to ask you two questions. One, certainly, as I asked the other panelists, what went on at Dartmouth, but also because I know that you've written somewhat extensively on this, if you would unpack just for level setting for the entire audience, unpack a little bit more this distinction between what we have been calling remote instruction or remote emergency instruction and a fully online course as we've come to know it within the tradition of online learning.
Sure. First, I just want to say, David, what an interesting time to become a college president. Good luck with that. And just to say thank you to Karen. My older daughter is one of those kids who graduated from her school, and I thought you guys did a pretty good job of keeping things going, and appreciate all the communication. So, we're both producers and parents here, so it's kind of interesting. All right, I'll start with the first part, and then, so Eddie and I have been writing a lot together, so maybe Eddie can help with the unpacking of the remote and online. Just really briefly about Dartmouth, we're on the quarter system. So for us, when we went remote in the spring, it was a new term. So we weren't kind of transitioning people in the middle. We had to start from an all remote learning for the whole term. Summer is, of course, all remote also. So by the fall, we'll have 2 full terms under our belt. So I think that gave some advantages, actually, in making this transition. What we did at Dartmouth is we quickly created these teams, and the teams had a learning designer, a librarian, and a technology professional. And these teams, the unit of analysis was each department. So the teams went to all the department meetings and worked with the departments, and then with the chairs, the faculty, to transition to remote learning. To give you kind of a quick about remote and online, and I think Eddie can also add to this because we've been writing about this. As David said, they're really different. Online is really resource intensive over a long period of time. Karen did this for years. She knows better than anyone what it's like to do online, and we were not doing that. I'd say at Dartmouth, what we tried to stress is what's really important in the classes at this time, which is faculty presence, engagement with the learners, really thinking about caring. We try to think about that, and just being really cognizant what a difficult situation this is for so many of our learners. How can educators connect with learners in this time to make the classes meaningful? So I agree, they weren't online learning, they were remote learning, and they were something different. And I think we've learned a lot. We can talk about where this will go in the future.
Eddie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that is great. I think Josh encapsulated that extremely well.
Okay, so I want to take 15 seconds of panel moderator privilege and just share that in addition, at Rutgers University, we did all of these things just as you described, and we clearly articulated again and again the remote instruction versus online learning, which we have been doing for over 20 years and supporting online degree programs, et cetera. But the other piece that no one mentioned, and I know that several of you have been doing this, that I just want to get out on the table, is faculty training. So we invested heavily in faculty training. We invested heavily in doing webinars and in doing sessions like this, whether it's WebEx or any other platform, recording those, creating a library of resources. And one number sticks out for me, that my team in March, during 1 week, did 95 training sessions in 1 week in March, and that continued apace. And while we're not doing quite as many now, we are still heavily invested in the faculty training piece, and that has become really important. And that's a segue then to our next segment, and I'm not going to be so rigid in terms of order. So whoever wants to take the first stab at this, I invite you to do so. And that is, okay, so we got through the emergency. We put the fire out. We got the fire under control. So now it's a controlled burn. The controlled burn gets us through the rest of the spring semester, and we close that out. And so now we reflect on this experience, and we've got a lot of different takeaways. And staring us in the face is summer term. And then, oh my goodness, what happens if this isn't over by the fall? So the segue, the next set of questions is around what lessons have we learned? What are the takeaways, and how have they informed and directed, frankly, our practice for both the summer and the fall? Let's start with the summer and then pick up with the fall, because I think that the answers may be slightly different. So anyone want to start us off on that? Yes, Eddie, please.
I'm happy to. I think in terms of thinking about one of the lessons, certainly building on the idea of this not being online even into the summer, that obviously I think idea carries, and I think you're absolutely right, Richard, in mentioning the faculty development. In fact, that's what I think of when I think of moving online. I think we have a lot of people who are moving to this remote environment. A lot of amazing people who worked incredibly hard. Like you, we had an insane number of engagements with our faculty. We did about 1,300 training sessions with faculty in March into early April. That kind of continued that maintenance, and it really, I think, allowed for that to happen at that moment in time in a way that it needed to. The metaphor that I had been using at the time, or the analogy, was to the film Dunkirk. And I know there's a real Dunkirk, but I was working with the film. We needed to get everybody off the beach, and you need to have a lot of people, a lot of help all around to do that. And we were able to do that in a very short period of time. But we also knew two things. One, or learned two things. Our students and our faculty were operating on a lot of adrenaline. There was a lot of goodwill. They were willing to go along with what they saw as an extreme circumstance that we all had to adapt to in a very, very short period of time. And as we move into the summer and then into the fall, I think there's an understanding that it's not that we have to do better, because I think everyone did an amazing job, and it becomes a kind of it becomes a really difficult way to try to judge quality in that sense, to say that we need to do better than we did in the spring. But we need to do something different. We need to do something that recognizes that we have some time to plan. We need to do something that recognizes that we have some time to actually do some development over the summer. We need to recognize that for us, unlike Josh and Dartmouth, we won't have seen our students potentially, depending on what gets decided in the fall. If we were to be fully remote, we wouldn't have had that month and a half of time with those students. We were able to build up relationships as we were able to do so in the spring before we had to go remote. So we know we need to take that next step, maybe in the next few steps. And so building the structure and the models to do that, I think, becomes a significant lesson learned. We did a lot of data surveys, gathering information and data from our students and faculty over the spring, and had a pretty good sense of where they saw the successes, where they saw some of the challenges, what they were feeling, and trying to then build an approach throughout the summer that helps us get ready for both summer classes in the fall has been really our next step from those lessons learned.
Karen, please.
So summer has always had online courses, and that will go off fairly well without a hitch, which is a real relief to people, because the courses were ready to go, and some new ones were added. But I think Eddie's exactly right to say that we have the planning time to be ready for the fall. No one, even though everyone wants to come back on campus, want to see the students back on campus, but also some trepidation about that, because we're not exactly convinced that under 22-year-olds are going to socially distance fully effectively. And many of our faculty are actually over 60. And so we want to ensure everyone's safety, and we want faculty to know that they're not going to be forced to come back onto campus. And no one knows whether we can come back onto campus or not yet. We're going to decide by mid-July what to do. But of course, the risk remains that we could go through the same kind of thing again. So it's the Dunkirk analogy, I think, that Eddie just raised as well. Having been through that kind of crisis, everybody understands that they need to be ready to deliver their courses effectively in an online format, make it more thoughtfully produced, to go with what Eddie was saying as well, than what was done before, which people are beginning to realize doesn't mean high quality polished video necessarily. It means thoughtfully produced. So for us, it's a moment out of those trainings and things that you've both mentioned, when faculty are attending to pedagogy in a way that, and I don't mean this in a critical fashion, faculty always think about their teaching, but they are now attending to pedagogy in a way that is so fresh and so eager. And rather than it being, a single sport like golf, it is a team sport. And so I sat through a group with my colleagues in the education department, talking to each other about how to teach effectively, talking about how to build community, really being respectful of the digital teaching and learning team and what they can bring to bear on pedagogy. So as Josh and Eddie might like to say, the turn to learning has become really rapidly addressed, and everybody wants whatever they do next, whether students are on campus or remote. And we know some of our students will be remote just for the fact that they won't be able to get their visas, or they won't be comfortable coming back to campus. Some of our faculty will remain remote. And so the pedagogy that includes the use of technology for both together and distance learning is really important to people. Two other quick things. One is that we are realizing, as many of us have said for years, how important it is for our graduate students to learn to use this technology and to be pedagogically sophisticated. And so the graduate students are also being included in the training, and they're going to be a critical part, as of course they have for years been, but even more so now. And then I think just the spirit of community and understanding that people are bringing to bear is incredibly impressive. I don't know what all of you might think, but it's seldom in a faculty meeting for many years at Brown have I heard people say, wow, the president and provost are doing such a great job. And this year I've heard it numerous times. So that's very refreshing.
That's great. And Karen, don't mean to put you on the spot and make you an apologist for your president, but I want to use it to highlight an example. I think your president issued a statement that the press was all over, but it seemed like if one looked at it a little more critically, a little more deeply, that the comments were initially misrepresented. Would you comment on that?
Well, point to the misrepresentation that that's in your mind, so I understand.
Well, the initial representation was the president of Brown was out there saying we're back as normal in the fall, and this was a renegade president going counter to everything in the country, and it turns out there was a much more nuanced argument being made.
So I think first of all, let me say that Chris Paxson, who I admire greatly, is after all an economist. She sits on the board of the Boston Fed, and so she was very much thinking about the need for business to come back to business continuity, as you've mentioned, Rich, and not just as a business, of course, as an enterprise that's critically important. The promotion of our youth, whether they're 18 or 38, the promotion of people who need knowledge and need what it is that higher ed provides is really important to the country, to the people, to the economy, and of course to higher education. So she was referring to the need for people to pay attention to that, for stimulus funding and whatever kind of funding in the future to be attentive to the needs of higher education, because it's a big piece of the economic engine, both because higher education is a significant employer, but more critically because of the product, so to speak, that we produce. And I think she was reflecting from the point of view of places like Brown that are residential communities, and all of the places that each of us sit at are residential communities, and that's important to our students. But I think we all have to understand that we can do things in multiple ways, and we can still make community. It's very interesting to be in meetings now and have people say, we all would like to be together, but give me one valid reason why it is this meeting or this course must be delivered in a face-to-face fashion. And it is those reasons are far and few between. So I think Chris was simply underscoring the values of higher education to our society, how important it is globally, and also pointing to the fact that many small institutions are really going to suffer as a result of what's happened.
And I think those comments were really insightful. And I highlight this. I raise this up as an example of how, in the midst of this pandemic, we need to be careful consumers of what is out there in the headlines, right? And so facts and science become critically important, and critical reading of people's full statements and full comments equally important. And so before we segue to the next topic, let me just ask David or Josh, anything that you want to add to that in terms of lessons learned and how that impacted planning for either summer or fall? Yeah, David.
There were a couple of things that I don't think we expected that came to light very quickly. One was that the emotional impact of COVID-19 was far greater than anybody expected and eclipsed anything having to do with pedagogy or course planning or anything else. Many students and faculty went through something akin to the 5 stages of grief. And we saw, not just at Marquette, but nationally, students bargaining, faculty bargaining, being angry, and really having to deal with the end of a semester, which they felt as a tremendous loss. The other piece that I think, as we're all thinking about fall, we spend a lot of time talking about calendars, and we spend a lot of time talking about, what happens if there's a resurgence, et cetera, et cetera. My own view is that these are all important conversations to have, but barring a catastrophic revival of COVID, this country isn't going back to any kind of social distancing. It's just way too economically painful and socially painful, frankly. So I think as we prepare for fall, we should really think about students just getting sick a lot and faculty getting sick, and not necessarily from COVID. We all know that the flu season is probably going to hit hard. And I actually think that the social distancing, the consequence of the social distancing is going to be reduced immunity for basic things like common colds and things, just because we haven't built that immunity up through daily interaction with others. And so, as I've been engaging with my colleagues at Marquette, I've been encouraging them to really think about offering instruction in multiple modalities as individuals need it, and not as a institution-wide one-size-fits-all for the entire community, because I just don't think that's how the fall is going to play out.
Josh, final word.
Yeah. So Eddie and I have been writing a lot and thinking a lot about the fall, and that's where a lot of my head is. And I guess the only thing I'll say here is, wow, the fall is going to be really hard. I think we're going to have a mix of students back on campus and people learning remotely and international students. And if we think sort of the last few months were difficult, buckle your seatbelt.
Thanks. I want to shift the topic slightly to a more futuristic view, or a longer range view rather, than just the fall. And before I do that, though, I want to invite our participants, our audience here, to please submit questions to the public chat that we have, and we're going to spend the next few minutes talking on this long range future idea, and then we're going to turn to your questions, and we'll ask the panelists to address your questions that may have come up from their insightful comments. And you can feel free to address a question to an individual panelist or just to the entire panel. That's fine. But please, we invite you and encourage you to submit your questions, and our moderator will be vetting the questions and will present them to us in a few minutes. So now I want to move us beyond the fall. So let's say we got through the emergency period. Overnight in the spring, we shifted. We got through that spring semester. We did our bit for the summer term, which is well underway. We're doing our planning for the fall. It's going to be difficult. It probably will be a mix. There may be some face-to-face. There will be some online. There'll be some remote. We'll have lots of dogs and cats going on in the fall. But what other lessons do you think have come out of this for higher education writ large? And it may not be things that we are doing at our own institutions, but the insights that you have gained from going through this and seeing not only your institution, but institutions around the country, what folks are writing, what suggestions do you see in all of this for the future of higher education? Who would like to pick up? Who'd like to get us started? This is a fun question. Oh, come on, David. You're the new president. What do you think?
So I think the financial picture is going to be very challenging for many institutions. And one of the big challenges, of course, is that in institutions that are primarily residential, like most schools in this country, have a budget model that is based on having those students living on campus and behaving like students. And when that gets disrupted, it becomes extremely costly, extremely fast. And so I know most schools are eager to just get those students back on campus, very much along the lines that Karen described, not in a small part because of the financial implications of not having those students living in the dorms and eating the food and socializing and doing all the other stuff that they do. And of course, paying full tuition. So I think one of the big challenges is going to be to wrestle with the likelihood that this pandemic will continue and is not going to be the last one for a while. We're probably going to have more, at least that's what the infectious disease experts in the country tell us. And that we're going to need to figure out how to adapt to those new realities, along with all the other changes that are taking place that are impacting higher ed.
So David, have we built too many buildings?
Well, we have too many small schools that have unsustainable business models. And we see that playing out both in state institutions and, as you know, Rich and others. I was at the University of Wisconsin for 11 years, and that's the university system with 26 campuses, and many of those campuses are very small, very similar to the Pennsylvania system, not Penn State, well, Penn State too, but also PASSHE. And and there's lots of other structures like that across the country. And that's on the public side. The private side's even worse. There are many campuses, as we know, across the country with 1,000, 2,000, maybe 3,000 students that are going to really struggle over a long time.
Josh, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I was going to pick up directly on what David said. I mean, I am really worried about the economic future of higher education in the next 12, 24, 36 months. I think what this whole pandemic shows is that our financing system for higher education is broken in this country. We have to make a concerted effort around public investment, reverse state disinvestment in our public institutions. All of us have a role to play in that, particularly at the community college level. But I think for every institution, we know that as David was saying, an enormous number of schools are tuition dependent, are going to have real challenges. I don't think we've wrapped our head around what the loss of so many international students will mean for our schools. And I think even in the best of circumstances, we're going to be facing layoffs and all that kind of thing. So I could, Eddie and I can also talk about kind of positive things about how we think we're going to come out of this, but I think we have to face up to very challenging economic realities over the next months.
Let's shift that in the next few minutes. Let's talk about some of these positive things that we've experienced that could potentially change higher education as we know it. Maybe Eddie and then Karen.
Sure. Well, I think I'll name two. One is I think we now know more about our students. We know more about their challenges. We know more about the things that they are struggling with day in and day out at home, and the impact that has on their ability to learn and their ability to engage. And I think that knowledge is both eye-opening for a lot of faculty, a lot of administrators across campuses across the country, and we're not everywhere. I think there were, certainly many people at institutions who pay attention to that more directly every day, but I think this has now become much more ubiquitous, and Josh and I have been talking about this and writing about this for some time now. And I think with that, I think one of the potential silver linings is this investment in trying to support our students in ways that we may have been falling down on as institutions. That's not going to help with the financial challenges that David and Josh were just talking about, but it might also be an opportunity to rethink those financial structures with a particular kind of investment. I think that care, that sense of community is so important to these institutions. There's certainly a financial commitment that we have to the models that are in place at these small schools that David was mentioning. On the other hand, there's also, I think, an opportunity to shift how we engage with our students, what the relationship is to that institution, not only at the moment that they happen to be there, the 4 years they happen to be there, but lifelong. I think there are different ways in which we can build off our opportunity to help students move in that direction toward lifelong learning. And that's the second thing I would mention. I think we're learning a lot about how our students learn, where they're successful. We are learning a lot about the things that we've been doing for a long time about teaching. Some of those things have been obvious for folks who've been spending their time thinking about this for a while. I think some of these things are also radically new. We find ourselves in an unusual situation that we have to respond to in ways that all of the design and all of the planning do not necessarily account for all of the variables and all of the different ways in which we have to adjust our expectations. But even if they were the same, it is now the case that every faculty member at every institution has experienced this investment in learning in a very intense, very particular kind of way that, again, as I think Karen said earlier, it's not that they weren't paying attention to this or thinking about this in different ways, but now it's been very intentional. It's been very focused. And I have to believe that, and certainly not only believe, but at least with the people that I've been talking to across the country, there is a sense in which that's going to carry forward well beyond the fall, or the spring. And that, we will see an investment in this idea that learning and learning innovation, that institutions need to pay attention to this, need to give care to this in ways that may not have been as prominent or present at a lot of institutions. And it's, it's of course unfortunate that it's a crisis that would make that happen. On the other hand, it's something that I think we can work with.
And Karen.
I really love what Eddie said about understanding our students. It makes me remember a conversation that I overheard while I was a participant in, where a faculty member said, and my students, wow, they have these challenges, these things that distract them, these things that are very hard in their lives, and it makes it hard for them to study. And I thought, those students have those challenges, whether they're sitting in front of you in a classroom or at home and on a Zoom meeting. And so thank goodness that you realize that you're not just looking at a classroom full of people who all have the same resources, same capacities, and same sort of lovely experience going on. Everybody has challenges. So thank you, Eddie, for raising that. But I think I want to pick up on Josh and David and the sort of the fragility of the higher ed financing system, which amazingly, only a couple of months ago, February, I think all the senior officers at all of our institutions thought that we were financially pretty solid. Some smaller schools were struggling already and worried about piecing things together. But for places like Brown or Dartmouth, we were fine financially. And suddenly, the underpinnings of our finances have been taken out from under us. We have a large pre-college program that is not happening this summer. And that is creating a severe blow to the revenues for our institution, among many other things. So I think reevaluating our finances is going to be critically important, as many of you have said. On the more positive note, I think that we've really learned flexibility. I think that this whole circumstance is making our institutions say, oh, maybe we don't have to have a standard agricultural structure of 2 semesters and then off you go for your summer farm work, which isn't the case in this country for the most part anymore, though that farm work is so important. And realizing that there are many ways to deliver education, many structures, many ways in which people can gain the knowledge they need to be thriving in their lives. And it doesn't have to be a 4-year package offered in 2 semesters or 3, as is the case with Dartmouth. And I think that's really refreshing because it will create some innovation in education that will serve learners.
That's one of the things that I find most exciting, is that has intensified the discussion about things like alternative credentialing and micro-credentialing and badging and a much more flexible model that is attuned and in alignment with the workforce. So I look forward to some positive changes in that regard. Go ahead, David.
I was just going to add that, one thing that concerns me, I think, at the macro level is that we have not had a national conversation about the role of higher education as a fundamental social good in our country for decades. And so the pain that we're all experiencing, the uncertainty and the fragility that Karen mentioned that we're all experiencing now, is a direct consequence of the lack of direction and embracing of the role of higher education and education in general that we struggle with. And I don't foresee that conversation coming up anytime soon in the political process. Certainly not under the current administration, maybe under a new administration, but there are so many other pressing priorities that I don't know if that's gonna come to the foreground anytime soon. And that's going to continue to be a real challenge, especially when, like you said, Rich, okay, so we want to talk about micro-credential and alternative credentialing, but given the current regulatory process, it's not going to happen. And so we need a way to align the regulatory process, the financial aid process, and the new needs of the Republic in ways that really have to be led at the national level.
I couldn't agree more. And two additional thoughts before we turn to questions. First is that I think another lesson that we've learned that we are incorporating for the future with particularly with our continuing education programs is that everything needs to have a virtual component because the demand is out there. There are people who don't have access. And that's my second comment. I think this crisis highlighted not just the divide within higher education, but the divide within the country, that not everybody has robust access to the internet, and you are tremendously disadvantaged if you don't. And so maybe reviving the discussion about national broadband, it's the time, right? So I'm going to turn to our moderator, Laura, and ask her to see what questions do you have for us, Laura?
Hi, so we have several questions. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but we had a question quite early on about faculty training. When you guys were talking about faculty training, the question is, were the faculty training sessions live or recorded? Did you have vendor support for that? Basically, how did that happen? And then I'm gonna add another person's question in that is about training for students versus faculty. So the question is, we talk a lot about instructing the teachers on online teaching. Do we have adequate instruction for students in online learning and online learning platforms?
Who'd like to pick that? Any takers?
So I'll just say quickly on the
Go ahead.
faculty instruction, much of it is delivered in the way that it's online, right? Because you want the faculty to experience what it is to be a student in the online environment, as well as learn how to use the tools and how to think about teaching. And so we're continuing over the course of the summer to run multiple versions of that. And there's nothing better than the eagerness of faculty being together as students and sharing really brilliant ideas about pedagogy. And it's totally exciting. And I'm glad, for one thing, that this crisis made people want desperately to be in those courses where they can think about their pedagogy. The student question is a great one. Who wants that?
I'll give it to Eddie.
I'll try. Actually, just to reinforce how great that question is, and it's one of the things that we're trying to pay a lot of attention to at Georgetown, and not sure that we've quite figured it out, but I think it's so important to understand that as we prepare for the fall, we have to do that in two different tracks. We have to be thinking about the faculty, and we have to be thinking about how we prepare our students to learn in whatever mode we happen to be in. And so I think that happens in a couple of different ways. One, I think it happens with faculty outreach. I think our faculty need to be connecting to our students now over the summer. They need to be talking with them about what to expect in the fall. They need to reach out in ways that show that they're invested in them, the students, as part of the community, not just consumers of that educational model. And a second is our faculty involving our students in the development of the courses that they're going to be teaching in the fall, making sure that they're actually part of the learning that's going to be happening, again, not as consumers, but as active participants. And so to help them understand what it means to come back to the campus and say, okay, I'm going to ask you to play a role in helping me manage this high flex classroom. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to rotate that through each part of each week throughout the semester or the quarter. Or when I set up a group assignment, I'm going to be really clear about my expectations, about the roles that you're going to be playing. I'm going to help to define milestones. I'm going to be responsive at every stage so that you're part of the engagement, not just going off to do an assignment or do an activity and then coming back and turning it in again, that kind of consumer exchange model. So the more things we can do to involve our students, to reach out to our students, and of course to have webinars and to have videos and things that will help to train our students to learn in that environment are helpful. But I think the first two are the most important, in part because they're the ones that we're probably least comfortable doing right now.
Laura, I think we have time for one more question.
What do you think of specifically large enrollment classes? Though they may be economically sound, are they viable fully online?
I'm not sure how much of a difference is there between, say, a 500 student online class and a 500 student lecture hall. neither one of them is great pedagogy unless you break up the students and you figure out how to engage them in the learning process. So you can create breakout sessions online just like you can on a campus. So I'm not sure that size matters. It's what you do with it in this particular regard.
Okay, and we are going to leave it there. Panel, thank you so much. You have been absolutely terrific. This has been lively. Our hour has flown by, and you have given some, not only some important insights and practical information, but you have also laid out for us some challenging things to think about at our respective institutions, in our respective communities, as we dialogue with others and as we engage in public discourse around higher education, education for all, educational access, and lifelong learning. So thank you all for that.